So before I go to Karthik, I just want to ask my other fellow panelists if they've got any questions for Vivek at this point. Okay, thanks. Thanks, Vivek. Moving on now to Karthik. Karthik, you've written a paper about the inclusive growth in Tamil Nadu, and not sure at that time you realized that it was going to actually become more popular in Tamil Nadu than other places. Our member of parliament, Ms. Kanimoli, also shared it on her Twitter, and then a lot of people who usually don't go through the website of Tony Blair Institute read that paper. So could you talk more about your paper and the experiences which you had in trying to put forward the points that you made in your paper?
Sure. First, let me say thanks for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here and a privilege, really, an honor to be speaking alongside Dr. Narayan and Dr. Srinivasan. Let me first say that I'm by no means an expert on this topic, not even close to I've not invested, not even close to the hours and the blood, sweat, and tears that the other two panelists have on this. But a couple of years back, I had a chance to dive into this subject somewhat. And in fact, actually, I think Dr. Narayan said that he drew on Dr. Srinivasan's work in his own work. And in turn, I drew on Dr. Narayan's work in the piece that I put together. So you can see some of the citations in the very long, endnotes. But let me just give a bit of background. First thing to say is that Vivek said that he spent his years growing up in Tamil Nadu, and then I think left at some point, I don't know when, in your 20s or something. I've sort of done the opposite. I was born and raised in the U.S. My parents migrated there a long time back, and now I've actually come back to India. So it's sort of a reverse story. And I think the reason I say that is because actually when I wrote the piece, it was primarily for a non-Indian audience, as you, I think, rightfully alluded to, right? I mean, I was working at that time for Tony Blair's organization. I for the last many years, I've been working with a number of different African governments around the issues around industrialization, job creation, that sort of stuff. And so, I've always been interested in making the connection back to where my family is from. And one thing that struck me is that I think outside of India, very few people actually have any real sense about the dramatic variation that there is across regions and across states and all this. And so I thought, okay, it might be actually quite useful to dig into this. And just like Vivek shared, even when I was in my studies and all this, I've studied sociology, political science, all this, and Kerala would always come up. And in fairness, my family also has ties to Kerala. And okay, fine. But Tamil Nadu actually never, came up in this sort of literature that we were seeing and reading and all this. And I thought, okay, actually, as I dug into it initially more and more, I thought, okay, this is actually, I think, a very interesting story to tell that I think very few people outside of India would actually know about. So that's sort of what caused me to go down this path, and the angle that I was coming from was, okay, India still has a lot of challenges, as all of us know, but nonetheless there's a lot of variation, as I said, and as we've said at the beginning, Tamil Nadu is a relatively successful performer across a wide range of areas, right? And so the question to me was, given the context that I've been working in, what could be learned from some of the higher performers, what you could call sort of the positive deviance in sort of like sociological speak. What can you learn from some of those places in India, right? So that was the motivation that I had, and what I was focusing on was largely the period from sort of say late 60s, 70s to the 2000s. I know that Dr. Narayan, among many others, has written about how maybe in the last 10, 15 years, sort of the performance has maybe slowed down a bit as compared to previous periods. But yeah, that was the period that I focused on. So, I did prepare a few slides. I'm not going to show them. I think I'm going to go straight to the sort of key point that I was focused on in my piece that I found very interesting, which was essentially the sort of what you could call a virtuous cycle that I was able to sort of understand a bit more about between productive development policies, so sort of the industrialization push, and investments in human capital, right? And I think the demand side around sort of human capital is what Vivek was speaking about, what Dr. Narayan also spoke a bit about. Given my background and what I've been working on, I was actually more interested in sort of the industrial development side of things, and as I learned more, I realized that these two things went hand in hand, right? So you can't really separate the two, as Dr. Narayan said at the very beginning, right? The fact that there's been such a highly educated population in Tamil Nadu has actually enabled diversification, further industrialization, all that sort of stuff, right? But the point the main point that I was making there was around this virtuous cycle of sort of pursuing the right sorts of policies that can enable diversification, that would push forward the state in terms of job creation, in terms of growth, this sort of stuff. And that obviously those phenomenon expand the pie, enable investments in human capital and all this, which then sort of leads to progress on health and skill development, all this, which then lead back to, as Dr. Narayan was saying, lead back to greater opportunities to pursue different sorts of growth paths, but develop different sectors, all that sort of stuff, right? And given that my professional background has largely been working sort of in the guts of government, not quite like Dr. Narayan. I'm not going to sort of put my record up against his. It's not even close. But I have worked inside of governments with sort of senior leadership in governments in a number of different places. And so governance, which is essentially what Vivek was talking about, the problem solving, the iteration in programs. To me, that's fundamentally what governance is, right? So what are sort of the governance elements that have actually enabled this virtuous cycle to take hold more in Tamil Nadu than other places, right? And so the three elements, and I'll only touch on these briefly, but the three elements that I picked out based on sort of my understanding of the literature and also a couple of interviews that I was able to do was one, around sort of the leadership element. So a forward-thinking, sort of inclusive vision that was put forth by the leadership, which I won't get into. I think Dr. Narayan and Dr. Srinivasan are much more knowledgeable about that issue than I am. But that's one. Two is, I think, a very important point, which is the commitment to and policy consistency around industrialization. Right. So there's a great quote that I had prepared actually from a former executive vice chairman at the Guidance Bureau, where he was essentially saying that, industrial development takes 40 or 50 years. It takes 2 generations, maybe longer. Right. But the political cycle is much, much shorter, as we all know. So having some sort of commitment, ideological commitment, but also a consistency of policy across successive regimes is incredibly important. And this is one thing that I've seen in many places, that is a really difficult trick to pull off. And it's not surprising. I mean, I've seen in many countries that actually, there might be leadership that wants to sort of make that commitment and wants that consistency. But if they get voted out the next time around, then, the new guy coming in sort of says, no, actually, I want to put my agenda forward. And so this ties, the fact that Tamil Nadu was able to pull this off actually ties back to some of the points that were made previously around sort of the core sort of ideological formation and movements that came out of sort of a common sort of set of ideas and identities, right? And so both the main parties and the state actually have not traditionally had that much difference in sort of their platforms, the way their agendas took shape, and that's what I think enabled this commitment and consistency. The last thing I'll say briefly is around what I want to call the state capability to execute, right? So I think oftentimes, especially these days, the institutional economics literature has become, has come to the forefront in terms of explaining development and variation development between different places. And, institutions matter. We hear this all the time, right? And what people are talking about when they say that is essentially, having the right rules in place and having the right, frameworks and, all that sort of stuff. And that's all well and good. But I think one thing that we see endemic in India and all across the world, frankly, I've seen it in many, many places, is it's not enough to have the institutions and the policy frameworks and all this. You actually have to be able to deliver. You have to actually be responsive to the needs and demands of citizens and of the private sector if you want to promote industrialization, right? That's exactly what Dr. Srinivasan was speaking about, right? And so that's what I want to call state capability, right? And Tamil Nadu, I don't have to tell this audience, I certainly don't have to tell Dr. Narayan, he's been part of this, but Tamil Nadu has traditionally had that in much greater depth than most other states. Right, and that comes partly out of sort of this, the sort of shared ideology across different political leanings, and how that's sort of linked up with the bureaucracy itself. I think also another key point that I want to bring out, it also came out of the fact that there were what are called in some of the literature pockets of effectiveness that were set up in the state government that were basically given the political authority and the sort of backing to be able to go ahead and execute on sort of the mandates that they were given, and to be able to proactively go out to citizens, if you're talking about service delivery, to go out to investors if you're talking about industrial development, and say, okay, this is what we can offer, what do you need, and then go and problem solve around those demands, right? In low capability environments, it's actually hard to know where to find that capability, and so being able to concentrate it in some particular places initially, and then build from there in terms of allowing that enabling that capability to permeate across the broader set of systems that you have. I see that that's also been a critical part of the Tamil Nadu story. So those are three of the sort of governance factors, you could call them, that I tried to pull out in my piece, but. I think I'll stop there, and happy to discuss more. And actually, I've been really enjoying learning from Dr. Srinivasan and Dr. Narayan about their experiences and what they've learned as well.
Thanks a lot, Karthik.